Welcome AP Psychology students. This video is about the neuron and how neurons communicate. So as we've talked about, your brain and nervous system are made up of billions and billions of these cells called neurons. And while there are many types of neurons, we're going to look at some of the properties that they all share and then talk a little bit about how these neurons communicate. So first, before you can really do anything else, you have to be aware of the major structures that all neurons possess. So we're just going to briefly go through those with you. First, you have the cell body, and you probably learned about cell bodies in your other science classes. We don't really get into these very much. We focus more on the structures that enable communication within neurons, but obviously there's important stuff that's happening in the cell body. But one part here that kind of branches off the cell body, these are called dendrites. And what dendrites do is they receive information from other cells. And as we're going to learn, the way that they receive that information is from chemicals that are called neurotransmitters that travel from one neuron to the dendrite of the receiving neuron. So we got our cell body, we got our dendrites, and then this long skinny piece here is called the axon. This carries an electric signal down the length of the cell that's going to, it's going to pass that message on, and then eventually it's going to lead to, communication with the next cell. When I think of the axon, I think of like a power cord, like for a TV or a computer or whatever, that, it's carrying that electric signal to, through the cord to the outlet. Wrapped around the axon is called the myelin sheath. This is a little bit of like a fatty tissue that, again, is around the axon, and it helps speed up the electrical signal that travels down the length of the axon. So think of this like with the power cord analogy, think of like the coating that goes around the wire. And if that gets destroyed, the wire doesn't work very well, if at all. And so same thing here, if the myelin sheath is damaged in a neuron, the axon, it's not going to carry that signal very well. And there are medical conditions that are related to the myelin sheath not working very well that we'll talk about later. When you get to the end of the axon, think of that axon terminal. Terminal means end. So at the end of the axon, we have these little branches. A lot of times people will get these mixed up with the dendrites because they're both branchy. But remember that the dendrites are going to be connected to the cell body. The axon terminals, they're the branches at the end of the axon. And what they do is through these little buttons at the end of the terminal, they release the chemicals, which are called neurotransmitters. And they are released across a tiny little microscopic junction called a synapse. And so the terminal button would release a little neurotransmitter across a tiny little gap called a synapse, and the dendrite of the next cell would pick it up. And what's interesting is this happens millions of times per second in your brain, and that's basically the biological foundation for human thought and human behavior and how our brain works. And so each one of these little branches will kind of reach out to a branch, a dendrite on a different cell. So any given neuron can be communicating with hundreds, if not thousands, of other neurons simultaneously. So it's much more complicated than this little simple diagram here. So that being said, that might be something you want to try because you're going to want to master the structures before you move on to the other parts of this video. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of taxing to try to remember it all. So maybe take a minute, see if you can draw one, kind of become familiar with all that terminology. That being said, how do neurons communicate? So understand that there's kind of two sub-processes with neural communication. The first one is within a neuron. That communication is going to be electrical. And then between two neurons, the communication is going to be chemical. So again, what happens is these dendrites get the chemical, the neurotransmitter, from the other cells. And if they get enough of those chemicals, they reach what's called a threshold. And then they send the message through the cell body to fire. and that's when the electrical current is going to happen. So there's two processes that kind of work back and forth with one another. So a couple things to know within a neuron. When the neuron is not firing, when the axon's not sending an electrical signal, this is called the resting potential. And so what's happening is the neuron is waiting to get those chemicals from, the neurotransmitters from the other cells. And then when they get enough, they reach what's called a threshold, and then it's going to be called an action potential. That's going to be the firing of the neuron. So again, the chemical part, there's going to be the neurotransmitters. Some of them are going to be called excitatory, meaning they want to speed up the communication. Others are going to be called inhibitory. They're going to try to slow it down. But you have these neurotransmitters in the synapse, and then the dendrite's waiting to pick those up. We're going to skip that for now. So before an action potential takes place, we got the resting potential. So this is taking place right here in the axon, the long skinny piece. So there's an electrical charge in this axon. The negatively charged particles or ions are inside the axon, and the positively charged ones are on the outside. They're separated, and they call this polarization. The ions are polarized. They're in different places from one another. When the dendrite, the branchy part at the beginning of the cell, if it gets more excitatory than inhibitory neurotransmitters, enough to reach a threshold, the message will be sent through the cell body to the axon, and it will give that message to go ahead and fire. When it's firing, again, the firing of the axon is called the action potential. These little gates open up on the axon, and the positive particles flush in, and they mix together with the negative ones. And when they're not separated anymore, they're not polarized from one another, they call that depolarization. So the positive rush in and they mix together with the negative, and it creates a spark when they come together. And so what happens is, think of it like a series of gates opening up like sequentially down the length of the axon. So the first one falls, then the next one, the next one, the next one, like kind of like a set of dominoes. The neuron either fires or it doesn't. There's not like hard firing, soft firing, strong firing, weak firing. It either fires or it doesn't if it hits the threshold, and this is called the all or nothing principle, or sometimes the all or none principle. After the neuron fires, we have what's called a refractory period. You've probably heard this term before, if you remember this from Unit 8. So we talked about, like with male anatomy, after a male fires, he cannot fire again for, however long. Well, here with the neuron, after the neuron fires, the action potential takes place. There's a short period of time where basically what happens is the positive ions have to get flushed out of the axon. They get to get kicked out. And during this time, the axon can't fire again. So this is known as the refractory period. Yeah, we talked about how it compares. And again, when we're talking about a refractory period, we're talking about like milliseconds. Because again, some neurons can fire up to 1,000 times per second. So this is happening so quickly. This is kind of a visual for you. So you think of this as like the length of the axon. These little gates open up. The positive particles rush in, mix with the negative, creates the spark. They get pumped back out, and then this it happens the length of the axon from left to right, all the way down. One analogy, I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't, that works pretty well is kind of the metaphor of how is a neuron like a toilet. And so here are some similarities. One, with the action potential, you flush something, that electrical signal goes down the length of the axon, the long skinny piece. When you flush a toilet, whatever substance gets flushed down the length of the pipe and it gets sent away. So there you see things moving down the length of a long skinny piece. There's a resting potential with a toilet. When the toilet is not being flushed, it's just sitting there, quiet, not doing anything. It's resting. There's a refractory period for a toilet. After you flush a toilet, there's usually a short period of time where you can't flush a toilet again. You've got to let the bowl fill up and the tank and all that kind of stuff, and you can't flush it again. And there's kind of an all or nothing thing with toilets as well. Like, there's not like, oh man, that was a really good flush, or it's like you hit the button, you pull the lever, it either flushes or it doesn't. I know with some old toilets it's not 100% accurate, but it's generally true with most toilets. It either flushes or it doesn't. So that is a very, it's a complicated process. We kind of gave you the simplified version of it. It gets more in depth if you want to get further into learning your neuropsych, but that's a pretty good introduction for now. There's, again, some practice quizzes on Moodle. I would encourage you to take a look at those, kind of interact with the material, and kind of get some repetition with it. So I think that is a good place for now, though. So we'll sign off for now, but thanks for being here. Thanks, guys.